Wow, the people treat me like I'm dangerous. I was just walking to Grandma's, but those cops looked at me like I was some kind of criminal. Marcus's voice broke the quiet in the living room as he turned to his dad. Chief Samuel Carter sighed deeply, his heart aching for his son. "Marcus," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Sometimes people judge others not for who they are, but because of their own fears and prejudices. It's unfair and it's wrong, but it's the reality we're working to change." He paused, meeting Marcus's gaze with a mixture of pride and sadness. "I need you to understand, son, you don't have to stay silent about what happened. Your story matters, and speaking up about it can help others who've been through the same thing." Marcus looked down at his hands, his emotions a tangled mess. "Do you really think I should tell people what happened?" he asked hesitantly. Chief Carter nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I do. If you're ready, sharing your story can shine a light on these kinds of experiences. It's not just about you, Marcus. It's about making sure this doesn't keep happening to others. Sometimes, change starts with one voice." The words stayed with Marcus that night as he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. A part of him wanted to bury the whole incident and forget it ever happened. But another part of him, the part his dad had inspired, felt a growing sense of responsibility. By morning, his mind was made up. The next day at school, Marcus stood in front of his friends during lunch, his hands sweating as he gripped the edge of the table. "I need to tell y'all about something that happened to me," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. He recounted every detail, the street corner, the officers, the assumptions they made, and how it all made him feel. Some of his friends looked shocked. Others nodded quietly, their own experiences reflected in Marcus's words. By the time he finished, the weight in his chest felt a little lighter. Word of Marcus's story spread quickly throughout the school and beyond. His teachers, classmates, and even people in the community started talking about it. The conversations weren't easy, but they were necessary. People began asking questions about fairness, about accountability, and about how they could do better as a community. Chief Carter, moved by his son's courage, took immediate action within the department. He organized a series of mandatory workshops focusing on empathy, active listening, and understanding the perspectives of the people they served. He brought in experts to lead discussions on bias and the importance of treating everyone with dignity. "These aren't just policies," Carter told his officers during one of the sessions. "This is about how we show up for the people we're sworn to protect. We're not just enforcers, we're members of this community." Meanwhile, Marcus found himself becoming something of an advocate. Teachers invited him to speak in their classrooms, and he even shared his story at a community meeting. Each time, the words flowed more easily, and he began to realize the power in his voice. He wasn't just telling his story, he was inspiring others to stand up, to question, and to demand better from those in positions of power. Months passed, and the changes in Crestwood were tangible. Officers were seen more often engaging with residents, playing basketball with kids, attending community events, and listening instead of judging. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One sunny afternoon, Marcus walked down the same Maplewood street where the incident had happened, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. This time, there were no stares, no questions, no suspicions. Just the sound of birds chirping and the steady rhythm of his footsteps. When he arrived at his grandmother's house, she greeted him with her usual warm smile. "You're making a difference, you know," she said as they sat on the porch. "What happened to you didn't break you. It made you stronger. And because of you, this neighborhood feels a little safer now." Marcus smiled, her words filling him with a sense of purpose. He knew there was still a long way to go, but he also knew that he had taken the first step toward a future where no one else would have to go through what he did. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Marcus felt a quiet resolve settle over him. Change wasn't just something he talked about anymore. It was something he lived. One step, one story, one voice at a time. This girl was quick. She darted through the automatic doors, hitting the pavement outside the store like a runner out of the blocks. Ryan bolted after her, his lungs burning as he pushed himself to keep up. She weaved between parked cars, her movement so light and fast it was like her feet barely touched the ground. Ryan's pulse thundered in his ears, partly from the chase and partly from something else, a creeping unease. Why was she so desperate? Shoplifting wasn't right, but the way she was running, you'd think he was chasing her for something much bigger. Ryan shoved the thought aside, narrowing his focus on closing the distance. He was gaining ground, but every time he thought he had her, she'd change direction, slipping between cars or hopping curbs with a kind of skill that made him wonder if she'd done this before. Just as she reached the edge of the lot, her foot hit a patch of loose gravel. For a brief second, she wobbled, her arms flailing as she fought for balance. Ryan seized the moment, lunging forward and grabbing her arm. He pulled her back, holding her steady. "Stop," he said, his grip firm as she began to thrash and struggle. She kicked, twisted, and clawed at his hand with surprising strength for someone so small. She was strong, stronger than he expected, her energy driven by sheer panic. "Let me go," she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. Ryan tightened his hold but softened his tone. "Hey, calm down," he urged. Though his words seemed to bounce right off her, she kept fighting, twisting like a trapped animal, her breathing erratic, her chest heaving as though she'd just run a marathon. He could feel her trembling, her fear radiating through her small frame. Even as her struggling slowed, there was a tension in her body, like she still wasn't fully there, her mind stuck somewhere else, somewhere far from this parking lot. Ryan eased his grip just slightly. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice quieter now that the adrenaline had begun to fade. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stared at the ground, her oversized hoodie swallowing her up as she hugged it tighter around her. Finally, after a long pause, she murmured, "Zoe." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Ryan kept his tone gentle. "Zoe, I need to see what you took." He watched as her shoulders tensed again. It was subtle, but it didn't escape him. After a moment of hesitation, she unzipped her backpack with shaking hands. She moved slowly, almost reluctantly. As she pulled out the contents, a small, well-worn stuffed bunny, some granola bars, a box of tampons. Ryan frowned, his confusion growing. This was it? This was why she'd run like her life depended on it? He crouched to her level, careful not to come across as threatening, and spoke softly. "Why did you take these, Zoe?" Her eyes lifted to meet his, and for the first time, Ryan saw the weight she was carrying. It wasn't just fear of getting caught. It was something deeper, something heavier. Her lips quivered, and when she finally spoke, her voice was brittle, cracking under the strain of her emotions. "I didn't have a choice," she whispered, her words barely audible. "I'm hungry, and I needed this stuff." Her eyes flickered down to the bunny in her hands, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Ryan's brow furrowed, struggling to understand. "A stuffed bunny? You needed this?" Tears welled in Zoe's eyes, but she blinked them back quickly, her fists clenching like she was holding herself together by force. "It's not for me," she said, her voice trembling. "It's for my little brother. He's scared all the time. This helps him sleep." Ryan felt a lump form in his throat. He glanced at the food and the tampons, realizing how little was there, and yet how much it must have meant to her. He sighed, lowering his voice even further. "Zoe, why didn't you just ask for help?" Her gaze hardened, though her tears still threatened to spill. "People don't care," she said simply. "They look at me like I'm a problem, not a person, so I stopped asking." The words hit Ryan harder than he expected. He stayed quiet for a moment, letting the weight of her reality sink in. Then, slowly, he reached for his wallet. "Look, I can't fix everything," he said carefully. "But let me help you with this." Zoe stared at him, her expression unreadable. Slowly, she nodded, though it was clear trust didn't come easily to her. Ryan handed her a few bills, enough to cover what she needed and then some. "Next time," he said, standing up, "just ask. Not everyone's going to say no." As she turned to leave, the bunny clutched tightly in her arms. Ryan stayed rooted in place, watching her go. His heart was heavy, but there was a flicker of hope too. A hope that maybe, just maybe, a little kindness could make a difference. Michael had been patrolling the aisles for about an hour, the faint buzz of the overhead lights blending into the monotony of the day. It was one of those shifts where nothing stood out. Customers moving through the store, carts rattling, shelves being picked over. All routine. Until he saw her. She couldn't have been older than 11 or 12. A slim, black girl, swallowed up by a hoodie that hung loose on her small frame, a backpack hanging off one shoulder. Something about the way she carried herself made Michael stop. It wasn't just her appearance. It was how she moved. Too calculated, too wary. Michael had been in security long enough to recognize the signs. This wasn't casual browsing. She was up to something. He stayed on his route, keeping her within his peripheral vision, making sure not to let on that he'd noticed her. He knew better than to spook someone too early. If you let them feel unnoticed, they'd either make their move or slip up. And this one, she was careful, like she'd done this before. Her actions were deliberate. She'd linger by a shelf, look over her shoulder, then drift to another aisle, always casting quick glances around. Michael felt it deep in his gut. She was about to cross a line. He started to close the gap. Slowly. Strolling down the aisle she was in, he pretended to inspect a nearby rack, his eyes discreetly following her every move. She had her phone in hand, tapping at the screen, glancing up occasionally, like it was her cover for loitering. Then it happened. She moved faster this time. Her hand darted out, grabbing something off the shelf and tucking it into her backpack in one smooth motion. No hesitation, no second glance. And then she was heading for the door. Michael's instincts flared. He knew he had to intercept her before she made it outside. But as he trailed her, a new thought crept into his mind. There was something more to this girl. Something heavier. It wasn't just about the act of stealing. The way she walked, the tension in her body. It felt like she was carrying more than just fear of getting caught. Michael stayed behind her, his pace steady but measured. As she got closer to the exit, he quickened his steps. He didn't want to scare her into bolting, but he also couldn't risk letting her slip away. Then she ran. Not the casual jog of someone trying to escape a small-time mistake. This was different. This was desperate. She took off like the world was closing in behind her, as if getting caught wasn't just about the stolen item. It was about everything she was running from. Michael's boots pounded against the tiles as he chased after her. She wove through the aisles, her backpack bouncing wildly with every step. Other shoppers barely had time to move out of the way as she darted past them, narrowly avoiding collisions. "Stop!" Michael shouted, his voice cutting through the commotion, but she didn't even look back. He grabbed his radio, calling for backup, though he doubted they'd make it before she was gone. Michael pushed harder, his focus locked on her. This wasn't just a chase anymore. There was something deeper going on, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The girl rounded a corner, knocking over a display of cereal boxes in her path, sending them scattering across the floor. Michael vaulted over the mess, closing the distance between them. The gap was shrinking, but she was fast. Too fast for someone her size. It was like adrenaline had taken over, fueling her beyond what seemed possible. He shouted again, his voice firm but not harsh. "Kid, stop! You're only making this worse." She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. She kept running like stopping wasn't an option. Michael's chest burned from the effort, but he wasn't giving up. He could see it in her. The fear, the fight, the determination. This wasn't just a theft. Whatever she was fleeing from, it was bigger than the store. As she neared the main entrance, Michael knew he had to act. If she made it outside, it would be over. The crowd, the parking lot, she'd disappear in seconds. "Hey, stop right now," he yelled, his voice cutting through the noise around them. But she didn't stop. She burst through the doors, the bright light from outside swallowing her up. Michael followed, his boots skidding slightly on the polished floor. He could feel every second slipping away, every step taking her further out of reach. The chase wasn't just about the stolen item anymore. It was about finding out what had driven her to this point. And as she disappeared into the streets, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't just lost a suspect. He'd lost a chance to understand something far more complicated than theft. Jada had barely looked at Michael since they sat down, her fingers clutching the straps of her backpack like a lifeline. He waited, giving her space, but the silence between them was heavy. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's never around," Jada began, her words shaky but steady enough to carry her pain. "She drinks a lot. Malik hasn't seen her in weeks." Michael stayed quiet, unsure how to respond. The anger that rose inside him wasn't aimed at Jada, but at the situation she'd been forced into. The adults in her life, the ones meant to guide and protect her, had failed. She was just a kid, carrying responsibilities no one her age should have to bear. He took a deep breath, trying to piece together his next move. He couldn't just let her walk away, but he wasn't about to throw her into more trouble either. There had to be another way. "All right, Jada," he said finally, his voice softer than he expected. "I'm taking you to see Malik, but we need to talk about what happens after that. You can't keep doing this, no matter how good your intentions are. Do you understand?" Her eyes snapped up to meet his, wide with disbelief. "You're not taking me to jail?" Michael shook his head. "No, I'm not. But this can't continue. We're going to figure out a way for you to care for your brother without putting yourself in situations like this. We'll figure it out together." The hospital wasn't far, a short drive that felt longer in the heavy silence between them. While she stared out the window, Michael made a couple of calls. The first was to his sergeant, explaining the situation. He knew this wasn't by the book, but rules didn't always account for what was right. His second call was to a social worker he'd worked with before, someone he trusted to help Jada and Malik. When they arrived, Jada led the way to Malik's room. The boy was asleep, looking impossibly small in a hospital bed surrounded by machines. Jada gripped the stuffed bear tightly but didn't wake him. Instead, she sat beside him, her hand brushing lightly over his cheek. Michael stood in the doorway watching. The love and protectiveness radiating from Jada were undeniable. This wasn't just about her stealing to survive. It was about her doing everything she could to keep her brother safe. The social worker arrived not long after, her calm demeanor instantly putting Jada at ease. Michael filled her in, and soon, Jada was telling her story. The mounting hospital bills, her mother's absence, and the weight of trying to care for Malik on her own. The social worker listened with genuine compassion, promising to look into resources that could help. She reassured Jada that she wouldn't have to handle this alone anymore. In the weeks that followed, Michael kept in touch. He visited the hospital, checked in with Jada and Malik, and followed up with the social worker to make sure progress was being made. It wasn't an instant fix, but bit by bit, the pieces were falling into place. One afternoon, Michael stopped by the hospital again. He hadn't planned on staying long, just long enough to see how things were going. Jada was waiting in the lobby, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Malik's doing better," she said with a small smile. "They think he might be able to go home soon." "That's great news," Michael replied, genuinely relieved. Malik had been through so much, and knowing he was improving felt like a win for everyone. Jada shifted the straps of her backpack, the same one she'd clung to that first day. "The social worker's been amazing," she said quietly. "They're helping with Malik's bills, and we've got food now. I don't have to, you know." Michael nodded, pride swelling in his chest. "You're doing great, Jada. I knew you would." She looked down, a shy smile playing on her lips. "I wouldn't have made it without you," she admitted. "You would have found a way," Michael said firmly. "You're stronger than you think." Before he left, Malik waved at him from his bed, the stuffed bear still tucked under his arm. "Thanks for helping my sister," he said, his voice quiet but full of gratitude. Michael knelt beside him, smiling. "You've got an amazing sister, Malik. She loves you more than anything." "I know," Malik replied, his grip on the bear tightening. As Michael walked out of the hospital that day, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. Jada and Malik weren't just another case. They were a reminder of why he'd joined the force in the first place. A few days later, Michael visited again. Jada greeted him with a genuine smile, the weight she'd been carrying now lighter. Malik was stable, and the future, while still uncertain, felt more hopeful than it had in a long time. "You saved us," Jada said softly as he prepared to leave. "No," Michael corrected, "you saved each other. I just gave you a little help." And with that, he walked away, knowing they'd be okay, and knowing he'd be there if they ever needed him again.